Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. Mike Gallagher watched from his second-floor bedroom window as his wife passionately hugged Jake Williams, the man who always said he was his best friend, at the entrance to their house. He brought her home from the city center, where they spent several hours together. This meeting was already their fifth date, and while Mike was watching and listening to what they were talking about, he found out about their plan to humiliate him even more. His so-called friend unequivocally told Christy that he wanted to spend a whole week with her, but after a little thought, she shook her head regretfully. "Not for a whole week, Jake, not yet," she said. "Maybe a weekend, but only on one condition." "What is the condition?" he asked. "You have to make Mike pay for our date," she blurted out, caught up in her own idea. He laughed. "That sounds stupid," he said. "You know I'm a lot richer than him. I will easily pay any expenses." No, she interrupted. "You don't understand the most important part of this idea." "And what is the point?" Jake arched an eyebrow at her questioningly. "Mike's humiliation," she said. "Come on, honey, admit that you like to humiliate him, don't you?" "Bullying him, making him feel like a piece of shit every time?" "Well," Jake drawled, "you know, he's actually my best friend and I am—" "Bullshit," the mistress snapped, rolling her eyes. "What I do know is that you like to lead him by the nose and humiliate him almost as much as I do. And it turns me on so much every time." She was so happy that she almost jumped on the spot. "Listen, Christy, let's get this running farce over with," he pleaded. "Come with me and just leave this sucker to his fate. I want to marry you and spend the rest of my life with you." She laughed. "I'll tell you what, stud," she finally said. "Let me get him to pay the bill in full for our hot weekend of wild lovemaking, and I'll think about your offer, okay?" Jake sighed with some annoyance, but then grinned. "Oh, I'm sure this weekend will definitely be very depraved," he whispered in her ear, hugging her and preparing to return to his car. "I'll talk to you soon, but don't keep me waiting too long." She watched Jake leave and even waved after him as he drove away, and then turned back to the house she shared with her husband Mike. Upon entering, she immediately began to undress, climbing the stairs. When Christy entered the bedroom, she met Mike's eyes, who was sitting on the bed. Throwing her blouse on the floor, she grinned and looked straight at him, unbuttoned her skirt, letting it fall at her feet. Christy went into the bathroom and began to examine herself in the mirror, leaving the door open. "You probably heard what we were talking about?" she asked casually, watching his reaction through the mirror out of the corner of her eye. "I'm leaving you for Jake. We're going to have a dirty weekend together, and you're going to pay all our expenses. Soon I will leave you for good to marry him." "I've been paying for everything since I married you 3 years ago," Mike said sadly. "I thought everything was fine with us. I did nothing but love you with all my heart and tried to show it every day. Don't you love me at all?" Christy just snorted contemptuously. "How could I even continue to love you?" she asked sarcastically. "To me, you're nothing but a slobber and a rag who lets his best friend date his own wife." Looking away from the mirror for a second, she saw Mike, turning to the window and lowering his shoulders, sniffing on the bed. "Oh, come on, be a man." With a dismissive chuckle, she threw in his direction. "Is that why you've been so disrespectful to me for the last few months?" "What about your vows before the altar?" "What is it?" he asked softly. "Do you really think that words that I once foolishly said will stop me?" Her voice was full of irony. "The loser and the weakling I see in this room doesn't deserve me. Please, Christy, please don't do this to me. I still love you and your cruel words break my heart." Mike's voice faltered as his gaze slid over her gorgeous figure. Even years later, and despite her attitude, he continued to look at her with loving eyes, as on that wedding day, when insanely happy, he held her hands and put a ring on his finger. Christy noticed that Mike was looking at her body with lust in his eyes. She snorted and shook her head. "Don't even think about it, slug," she said. "There's no way I'm going to let you touch me again. When I want to, I'll call a real man to come and use me properly. What about you?" "Well, hubby," she grinned maliciously, "so be it. I'll let you sit in a chair in the corner and watch me have fun in front of your eyes." "Oh, and maybe," Christy brightened up here, and her eyes sparkled as a funny idea seemed to come to her head. "I'll let you. No, I'm going to order you to sit in the corner and watch me being used, if you behave yourself. Carried away by her fantasies, Christy did not notice how every minute the features of his always soft face turned to stone, the skin on his cheekbones stretched rigidly, and the fingers on his hands involuntarily clenched into fists. "Damn you," Mike muttered hollowly, getting out of bed. Christy's hand, brushing her curls, stopped in mid-stride. It was the first time her gentle and loving husband had uttered such rude words to her. Straightening up and turning her head, she watched with her eyes as he left the room and started down the stairs. Intrigued and somewhat alarmed, Christy threw the comb into the sink, hurried after Mike downstairs, and saw him reach for the front door. "Where are you going? Will you go to the pub, get drunk, and complain to the bartender about your worthless life? Or maybe you'll run to Mommy and cry on her shoulder like a little boy?" She chuckled sarcastically, standing on the stairs with her hands on her hips. Pausing for a moment at the door, he stared at her in silence for several long seconds with sadness in his eyes. Upstairs, in their former family bedroom, he realized that he had taken everything he could from her and decided that he no longer owed this woman anything. "Goodbye, Christy," he finally said before slamming the door. She heard his car door open and then slam shut. The engine roared, and a few seconds later she saw him drive away. "Where is he going?" Christy wondered in disbelief, but then she just shrugged her shoulders. To hell with him, she thought carelessly. Good riddance to horned trash. She grabbed her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Hello, darling," she cooed. "My slug has crawled out of the house somewhere, so why don't you come? Are you leaving already? Hurry up, I can't stand it." 3 days later, Michael drove up to the house. Opening the garage door with a signal from inside his car, he drove inside and closed the big door. Grabbing his briefcase, he strode purposefully into the house. Christy was sitting at the kitchen table this morning, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee. Michael didn't say a word to her, just walked past his wife, who raised her head and went to his home office. Curious, Christy hurriedly got up from her desk, went to the door of his office and tried to enter. She turned the handle, but the door was locked. Strange, she thought. My husband never locked this door. She knocked on the heavy wooden upholstery and, when the lock clicked a few seconds later, turned the handle. When she opened the door, she saw him sitting at his desk. He was carefully examining a map of some area on his computer. Christy knew that Mike was in the process of designing a housing estate around one of the many lakes in the area and decided that the map was exactly what he was working on. "What do you want?" "What is it?" he asked abruptly, looking up at her with a heavy gaze. For a moment, she recoiled and felt unsure of herself. He had never been harsh with her before, but on the other hand, she realized that she had been rather disrespectful to him lately. I was worried," she replied, managing to clear her throat from the sudden hoarseness. "You left 3 days ago and I haven't heard from you. I tried to call you on your cell phone, but you still haven't answered. Are you sure you were really worried about me?" He asked the question with obvious sarcasm. Christy paused for a moment. Was it really her Mike? He looked like Mike, he sounded like Mike, but there was something about him, a little different, as if he had changed inside. Perhaps she had gone too far with him. She tried to reach out to stroke his cheek, but he managed to dodge her touch. "Don't you want to kiss your wife?" "What is it?" she asked resentfully. "It's been 3 whole days since I last saw you." He studied her for a few moments as if she were some kind of disgusting insect that had to be examined under a microscope. Then he shook his head. "No," he said, returning to his computer. "Please close the door when you leave." By now, Christy was really confused. Her husband never refused her attentions and always kissed her at any suitable opportunity. This same man, calmly sitting in front of her, was like that, cold. She backed away, carefully closed the door to his office, and immediately went to the master bedroom to get her phone. She dialed a familiar number, and the man answered after the first ring. "Jake, he's back," Christy said. "But, I don't know. Something is wrong. It was as if he had become a completely different person. He didn't even kiss me when he came into the house." "Don't worry so much about it, honey," Jake boomed soothingly into the phone. "He probably just realized that you're leaving him and there's nothing he can do to stop you. I'll come over tonight and the 2 of us will take care of everything. Just let me talk to him for a few minutes and I'll sort it out." "Okay," Christy said, not too confidently. "I hope you're right and everything will be fine. See you tonight, my sweet. I kiss and love you." Michael heard half of her conversation and smiled as he returned to his computer. That evening, Jake pulled into Mike's driveway. Christy opened the door and let him in, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him fervently as he entered. "Where is he?" Jake asked when she pulled away from him. Christy pointed to the office door. "He's been sitting there all day," she said. "Let me have a few words with him alone," the lover said, heading for the office door. "It won't take long." He knocked on the door, finding it locked. "Mike, it's me, Jake, your friend. Can we talk for a few minutes?" The door lock clicked and Jake stepped inside. He smiled amiably and wanted to move forward, holding out his hand, but after taking a couple of steps, he stopped. The owner of the house sat at the table, leaning back in his chair and stared at Jake intently, without even making an attempt to move. The smile slipped from the guest's lips, and his hand, which was absurdly hanging in the air, slowly descended. "Close the door behind you and sit down," Michael commanded, pointing to an empty chair. Jake closed the heavy door and sat down, and Michael, taking his time, poured himself a drink. "Aren't you going to offer your friend a drink?" Jake asked as the owner of the office screwed on the cap of the scotch bottle and put it back on the counter. Michael stared at him for a moment as if he were an empty place. "A friend? Are you really my friend?" Michael asked. Jake looked confused, looking away. Damn, Christy was right. Now the weak, malleable beta male he was used to dealing with was no longer sitting in front of him. "Of course," Jake said. "I've been your best friend for years, remember?" Michael chuckled. "Best friend, right?" he drawled, as if tasting and rolling this simple phrase on his tongue. "Tell me, my dear. Best friend. What kind of friend is this who steals the wife of his old friend? Eh?" "Mike, I'm sorry that," Jake began before he was interrupted. "You can't wait to get Christy, right?" he asked. Jake nodded his head. "And how much do you want her? In other words, how much do you think it's worth? What are you talking about? I don't understand what you mean, Mike," Jake said, puzzled. "Don't play dumb, Jake," Michael said with a grin. "You are a very experienced business person with a tough commercial acumen. Otherwise, you would not have been able to earn all these millions of your own. You know that there is always a price to pay for any deal. So I repeat my question. How valuable is Christy to you?" I don't know," Jake muttered, confused. "It seems that you want to offer me something?" "That's right, buddy," Michael confirmed with a wry grin. "I really like your new Bentley." "How much did you pay for this thing?" "I paid over $500,000 for it. It was made on special order," Jake replied with an ill-concealed hint of braggadocio. "I understand that the entire amount for the car has already been paid, right?" Michael asked. "Of course, he's all mine," Jake said. "Well, that would be a good way to start our deal." Michael smiled and twirled the glass in his fingers, examining the iridescent liquid in the light. "Your health." He saluted Jake, raising his glass, and took a sip. "Wait, what?" Jake drawled, as if he couldn't believe his ears. "You want me to give up my Bentley? In exchange for Christy?" Michael smiled thinly. "Along with 25% of your net worth," he added casually. Jake's eyes suddenly became square. That, more than $50 million, Jake exclaimed breathlessly. "Are you kidding or are you just crazy?" "According to my research, that's exactly $52,450,389 and another 25 cents, Michael said, glancing briefly at his computer. "And you're wrong. I'm serious. Absolutely serious." Jake jumped up from the offered chair and began nervously pacing the office from corner to corner, muttering something to himself and occasionally casting hostile glances at Michael. He sat calmly at his desk, absently sorting through papers, and did not seem to pay much attention to his friend's throwing. Finally, he stopped his Brownian motion around the office and plopped back into his chair, staring at Michael with tension. "So, you want my car and 25% of my net worth in exchange?" "For Christy?" Jake asked. Medha and Christy was right. This was not the person he was used to manipulating so easily. "Why do I even need to think about it? I already have your wife." Grinning, Michael opened one of the documents on his computer and printed it out. He pulled a sheet out of the printer that beeped briefly and handed it to Jake. "Yes, but what do you think will happen when your board of directors and your shareholders one day receive this? Do you think you will remain as rich and powerful when this scandalous document gets into the media?" "I doubt it," Michael said, pouring himself another scotch. "It's the same blackmail," Jake rasped painfully after reading the letter, which described in detail all the facts and details of their affair, as well as how he and Christy had been morally mocking Mike and humiliating his dignity for a long time. Maybe. Think what you want, but my offer is valid only until tomorrow afternoon, Michael said. After 12 o'clock, it will increase to 50%, plus a controlling stake in your company. You want Christy. That's my price. Yes, this is a robbery on the highway, Jake exclaimed angrily, throwing up his hands. You'll never get away with it. Maybe yes, maybe not, Michael drawled thoughtfully, sipping his drink. I know you want her, although God only knows, he shrugged, why you need her, but that's my price. And I'll tell you something else. If you accept my offer without any conditions, I will make sure that the two of you spend the rest of your lives together. I will disappear and never bother you again. Isn't that what you want? Well, yeah, I'd love to spend the rest of my life with Christy, Jake said. Michael smiled. You see, if you agree to this, I'll even promise to cook a festive dinner for the two of you, Michael offered. I need some time to think about it, Jake replied. Michael nodded his head in understanding. I'll give you until noon tomorrow, and don't forget, he added, defiantly arching his brush and tapping the dial of his wristwatch with his fingernail. Time has gone. The former friend took a handkerchief out of his breast pocket and impulsively wiped his sweaty face and neck with it. Now please close the door behind you when you leave, Michael added, indicating that the meeting was over. I'm not keeping you any longer. Jake stood up in confusion and walked stiffly out of the office. The owner of the office watched through the curtains as Jake and Christy left the house. He smiled and made some calls. Christy returned home only in the early morning, in her lover's car. Michael heard them talking in the driveway. Just think about it, Jake said. In just a couple of days, we'll be able to start our new life, free of Mike. And now let me go inside and taste the taste of these buns for breakfast, he added. She giggled and pulled his hand away. Not now, but soon enough, she promised. I can't wait for Mike to serve us as a waiter. Christy kissed him and watched Jake drive away. Then she entered the house and saw the light in her husband's office. I wonder if he's been there all this time, she thought. She tried the door, but it was locked. Mike, she called through the door. I want to... Go away, Michael's voice came to her. Christy hovered a little longer at the locked entrance, listening, but then decided not to press him anymore. She was more than concerned about her husband's strange behavior and went up to the master bedroom. The next morning, Michael received a short message from Jake. Deal. He immediately replied, indicating the offshore account number and a warning that he would monitor the transfer of funds to ensure that the transaction was completed. A couple of hours later, Michael confirmed that the agreed amount had been fully received, after which he instantly transferred it further, dividing it among several other accounts that he had access to exclusively. After finishing the money matters, he sent messages to Jake and Christy. Dinner will be held today at my expense. Be here at 7 p.m. sharp. He went to get the ingredients he needed for dinner for the night, and returned an hour later, fussing in the kitchen. Michael loved cooking, and there was something particularly sentimental, bittersweet about tonight's farewell dinner for him and his guests. Christy returned home around 6 p.m. that evening and went straight to the kitchen. She had never seen or had any idea until that evening that her husband could cook, but apparently he knew a lot about the kitchen. Whatever he was cooking, it smelled delicious. I didn't know you could cook, she said with genuine surprise. He looked at her with a raised eyebrow and leaned both hands on the table before he spoke. There's a lot you don't know about me, he replied, wiping his palms with a rag. Maybe if you stayed at home from time to time instead of running away from it to your lover, you would learn something too. At least I learned my lesson and learned how to stand up for myself. Now go and get yourself cleaned up. Your date will be here soon. She tried to kiss him on the cheek again as she had yesterday, but he turned his head away and recoiled to avoid touching her. Christy backed out of the kitchen and then ran upstairs, a tear streaming down her face. What have I done? She asked herself. A few minutes before 7, Jake appeared and rang the bell at the entrance. Michael opened the door and let him in. Without delaying the matter, Jake took signed documents from the folder he had brought with him at the door and handed him a bunch of keys to the Bentley. Business comes first, doesn't it? Michael grinned. As I promised, Jake replied and coughed. Damn, my mouth is dry from all these events. Can I have something to drink? Thank you for keeping your promise. I'll treat you and Christy to some great champagne soon so you can really celebrate, Michael said, pocketing the keys. He was looking forward to getting behind the wheel of the new Bentley. Soon, Christy came downstairs. beaming with freshness and looking simply stunning in a short black dress with a completely open back, which left no room for imagination. Michael noticed that she had taken off her rings. Christy walked over to the dining table, and Michael politely pulled out a chair for her. She smiled at him as she sat down, but he did not return her smile. Jake sat down too, smiling wider than a Cheshire cat. "You look beautiful, my dear," he said to her, kissing her hand and looking at her adoringly. "And I see that you've finally taken off your rings." "It is very good." She smiled again when Michael brought 2 glasses of champagne and placed them on the table in front of them. He returned to the kitchen and returned a minute later, carrying a large dish in his hands. When he took off the lid, a cloud of steam burst out, and they all inhaled the aroma of Michael's lasagna with delight. "It smells divine, Mike," Jake admitted, straightening the napkin on his lap. "Perhaps you missed your true calling." Michael said nothing, serving 2 portions, 1 for each plate. Christy picked up the instruments but stopped, looking up at him. "Aren't you going to join us?" "What is it?" she asked. Michael shook his head, pouring champagne into tall glasses. "No," he replied. "This festive dinner is just for the 2 of you. I don't want to stop you from enjoying your meal and each other." Michael stepped aside and watched for a while as the lovers sipped champagne, toasting each other and a happy future together. Soon they stopped paying attention to him and did not even notice how he retired to his office with a wry smile on his face. Sinking into an armchair, he glanced at his watch. Any moment now, Michael thought. And indeed, very soon he heard the rattle of a fallen fork and 2 thuds. When he came out of the office and looked into the dining room, he saw Christy and Jake slouched in their chairs. Jake's pale face was crushed under a plate of half-eaten lasagna, and his left arm hung almost to the floor. Christy's body, with her dress pulled up on her hips, slipped a little off the chair, seductively exposing the ties of her stockings. Her head bent and on the floor, under her hand leaning back on the arm of the chair, fragments from a broken glass scattered. Good, he thought. They'll be out for at least 6 hours. Michael changed his clothes and got down to business, undressing both lovers, intertwining their bodies and tying their arms and legs around each other. Grabbing a wheeled cart from the garage, he took the 2 outside, after wrapping their unconscious bodies with heavy chains, to which loads were attached for reliability. Michael put balloon gags in their mouths in case they woke up before he got to his destination. It wasn't easy, but he still managed to put them both in a large canvas bag that he bought especially for the occasion. Using a trolley and a portable lift, Michael heaved the bag of lovers into the trunk of the Bentley, and then closed and locked the lid with a key. Under the numerous stars that spilled out on the rapidly darkening firmament, he got into the car and headed out of the city. When he reached his destination a few hours later, he heard a scuffle and a muffled mooing, after which he loosened and opened the neck of the moving bag. 2 completely stunned heads poked out, looking around in undisguised panic in the darkness that had gathered around. Michael bent over them, taking a small pocket stun gun with him. "If you promise to remain silent, I will remove the gags and answer any questions you may have," he said. "But if you scream, I guarantee you won't like my reaction," he added, showing off the taser in his hand. They nodded their heads almost simultaneously, and Michael released them from their gags. "Where are we?" Christy asked in horror. "Who are you? What's going on anyway?" There was clearly a note of panic in her faltering voice. "Yes," Jake said. "What the hell is going on here?" "According to my GPS, we're at the exact spot where your husband committed suicide," Michael told his unfaithful wife. "What? Mike, you committed suicide?" Christy screamed, her eyes widening. "How is that? What are you talking about?" "Yeah, he told me all about how mean you've been to him over the last couple of years. Cuckolding him, humiliating him, and a lot more," Michael said. "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about my manners. You probably think I'm Mike. Actually, I'm his twin brother, Michael. Not only do we share the same DNA, but it just so happens that we have the same name and the same middle initial." Jake and Christy stared at him in shock, like a pair of deer on the road caught in the headlights. "I warned him about you, Christy, but he lost his head in love and didn't want to listen to me. You have no idea how close I was." Michael brought his thumb and forefinger almost close together, to stepping in and saying something at the moment when the priest said, "If anyone has a reason why these 2 shouldn't get married, let them say it." "About it now, but I didn't do anything then, and I still blame myself for it," he added bitterly. Were you at our wedding?" Christy asked, startled. "I don't remember seeing you." You see, Christy, although Mike and I have a lot in common on the surface, we are actually completely different. He was a patient and kind-hearted man who always got along with everyone around him. Unlike me, he avoided conflicts in every possible way. And most importantly, he loved you with all his heart and was willing to put up with almost anything just to make you happy. I, on the other hand, I've seen right through you from the beginning. I was sure that you were an insidious bitch who would cheat on him at the first convenient and profitable opportunity for you. How did I know that? Well, you can call it intuition, sixth sense, or epiphany. It doesn't matter. For Mike's sake, I just hoped I was wrong about you, but unfortunately I was right, he added dejectedly, clasping his fingers tightly and looking into the distance. Mike never said anything about having a brother, Christy muttered. Yes, because I strongly asked him to, Michael said. You see, officially I don't exist. I would tell you why. Wait a minute, though. He threw back his head and laughed. As you can see, it's already dark enough now that you probably won't recognize the surrounding area, Michael continued after he finished laughing at his own joke. If you're still interested, we're in the deepest part of the bottomless lake, the very place where Mike ended all this shit a few days ago. You see, Christy, he couldn't stand what you did to him anymore, and he chose the easiest and fastest way out. I tried to stop him, but he was inconsolable. Tears were streaming down Christy's face. Mike, did he commit suicide? My God, I never wanted this, she asked in a trembling voice. You threw it in his face that you didn't love him. You might as well put a gun to his head and pull the trigger. Michael looked at Jake. And as for you, asshole, you've been pretending to be his best friend all these years, and you still haven't answered my question. What kind of friend is this who steals his friend's wife? What, are you silent? Are you lowering your head? Maybe you finally feel ashamed, Michael asked with undisguised sarcasm. The truth is, you bastard, you've never been his friend. You used him to get what you wanted. You enjoyed playing on his feelings, cuckolding him and humiliating him at every opportunity. But after all, you promised me that Christy and I would spend the rest of our lives together, remember? Jake asked hoarsely. He raised his head and practically growled, glaring angrily at his captor. Did you lie to me? You tricked me. Michael just laughed. You're right. I told you that the two of you would spend the rest of your lives together, and I wasn't lying about that, Michael said. So yes, your future life together will be stormy, but very short. You'll even die together on the same day, like in all those romantic stories. Michael grinned. And it's damn well deserved since you two conspired against my brother. Please don't do this to me. With us, Christy sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks. Michael looked at her coldly and darkly. Mike told me that he begged you with the same words before you humiliated him and cuckolded your lover. But then you just laughed in his face and told him to put up with the role of a cuckold that you had prepared for him. Well, now it's your turn to accept the inevitable. You're just a crazy psycho, she screamed and twitched inside the bag. Release us immediately. You're not going to get away with this. Michael shrugged his shoulders. Maybe not and maybe yes, he said. But once your farewell message is found on your computer, it won't matter anymore. Although, he chuckled, I have to admit that this is a very, very touching and heartwarming letter. But let's change the subject. You probably know that no one has ever found the bottom of this lake. It's not for nothing that they call it bottomless, and there is enough weight on this chain, tightly wrapped around the two of you, to be sure that your descent will be fast. Michael reached out and tugged at the jangling links of the chain. Both accomplices, as if paralyzed, stared at him with round eyes of horror. Both were trembling violently. According to my estimates, the two of you will last no more than 60 seconds before you lose consciousness. You may even live a few more minutes after that. Well, it's time to say goodbye, Michael sighed with a wry smile. It's a pity that this time we will have to do without a priest, rings, solemn music, and an official ceremony. Well, anyway, I hope you enjoy your honeymoon after all. Enjoy. Michael completely untied the bag and, exerting all his strength, turned it over until the pair of lovers, desperately twitching, fighting with each other and screaming in horror, fell into the water. Bon voyage, he said softly at last, watching as the silver cocoon of chains, fading pale, disappeared into the inky depths, and many bubbles floated to the surface. Soon the bubbles stopped appearing, and silence reigned over the dark surface of the lake, cut only by a glittering path of moonlight. Michael started the boat's engine, which began to chug softly, and headed back to the harbor pier, guided by the lanterns of the pier making their way through the pre-dawn fog. There he moored the boat, turned off the engine, and jumped into the Bentley, parked discreetly in the dense shadow of the docks. Turning the key in the ignition, under the quiet purr of the revived engine, he made a mental note. Burn the bag to destroy all traces of its previous contents. He then took out his phone from his inside pocket and sent a short text message. "It's done." The answer came almost instantly. "Thank you, brother. Enjoy the ride."